Hi guys, Jeff Westfall here again with some more square stance training. Today we're going to talk about connection, making connections. Now that sounds very vague and sort of new agey, so let me explain what I really mean. When you look at the martial arts in their entirety, you've got striking techniques and you have grappling techniques, to name two categories. And each of those tends to have place premiums on things that the other one does not. Grappling tends to want to minimize the space we give our opponent. Striking, we need room, we need space to strike, although you can strike in close range. Striking tends to extend energy out away from you. Grappling tends to pull the energy back in many cases. These are just broad generalizations here, and those can be dangerous. The things that you learn to do to set up good striking can be very different from the things that you learn to do to set up good grappling. There is a world that is right at the edge between the two, an interface between striking and grappling, and that's when you first make a connection with the opponent. And what does a connection mean? To me, a connection means when I am attaching myself to my opponent without damaging him, or without putting priority on damaging him. Instead, I'm trying to attach myself to him to create some kind of influence on him. So let's look at two examples of this. Our first example, and since this is square stance training, I will be squared up to what I'm attaching myself to. A little more on that later. So I'm square, I've got this board screwed to these studs on this wall here, and my basic connection is going to be very simply to put my palm on that point. Now there's a spectrum of commitment to my connection. If I turn and extend my arm as far as I can and not lose any balance, and I can't go any further without starting to tip, that's one end of the spectrum. Now, as I move my feet further away and I begin to sag my hips, I get a much more committed form of connection. I've got a lot more pressure going into this connection. And pressure creates connection. When I push on my opponent, whether it's with my palm, or my forearm, or my elbow, or my knee, or my head, whatever I'm pushing on my opponent with, I create a connection with them that I can use in different ways for manipulation. This will be a common theme with anybody who trains with me or anybody who trains with any grappling coach. And in any of the interfaces between grappling and striking, like the clinch in Muay Thai and the clinch in boxing, learning how to use this kind of pressure can be very useful. The other form of connection, instead of being pressure, is a catch. This is where I grab. Ideally, these evolved to grab things. That's my best grabber, but I have other grabbers. I can grab with the crook of my elbow. I can grab with the crook of my shoulder in the armpit here. I can grab with any aperture in my body. Now, so I grab, and once again, I square up, and there's a certain distance where, this doesn't have to be cloth flexible connection, by the way. I could do this with a trapping dummy and grab the arm. anything that will hold me up. So I square to it, and if this thing were to stay here and it wouldn't drop on me, the closest I can get and grab it without having to have any pressure on it, that's the beginning of the spectrum of commitment. Then, in opposition, in the opposite direction to the commitment when I was creating a pressure connection, a catching connection or a gripping connection, I increase the commitment by moving my feet in. So now, there's a certain point in both forms of connection where it's the maximum amount of commitment I can make and still feel safe to go on with other techniques. I don't feel like I'm so overcommitted that I'm ridiculously vulnerable. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So you have both catching attachments and pressure attachments. And each of them can be used in different ways. Now, is from square stance the only way you can attach to something? Of course not, no. What we're doing here is I'm trying to show you some of the things you can do from square stance. For example, very frequently in the clinch, I will be square, my opponent will be square, and the clinch suddenly dissolves. I am very vulnerable right now to impact coming this way. But if I can turn and create a pressure connection, he's not going to be driving me backwards, and I've created structure right from that position. Maybe faster than I could have if I had taken the time to reposition my feet. There's all kinds of reasons why this can be very valuable from a square stance. It's perfectly possible for me to be on a bladed stance, a boxing stance, a kicking stance, and create a connection in all of those. The more I am towards the bladed stance, however, the more risk I take of allowing my opponent to get behind me. If this slips or crumbles, it's very difficult for me to protect my flank, my posterior face, back that way. So whether it's a catching connection, that dissolves, or a pressure connection, either way. So one of the advantages of a square stance, making a triangular connection, the triangle being this point of connection and the 2 feet, making this triangle in 3 dimensions of space, it's very difficult for my opponent, even if this were to dissolve, to get around to my flank. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the kinetic spectrum. Now, this is my name for this. It's perfectly possible for me to strike my opponent with my connection. So if I'm at a little bit of a distance out here, I can hit with that connection and do damage with my palm. That's not the primary purpose of a connection, but it's important to understand that under the right circumstances and with the right coordination, I can do damage with that, get a secondary effect that can be very useful in addition to the connection I've made. The other end of that kinetic spectrum is when I simply place my hand there and make a connection without any thought to doing damage, or any progression in between. I want to talk now about what happens when your connection changes. And what I mean by that is this. There are sort of 3 states your connection can be in. Your connection can be stable, it can be there, it can dissolve, which means maybe my opponent's got that hand right on my head, and he's out in that triangle connection on me, and I back up. Okay, that's an example of this dissolving. My opponent doesn't cooperate. He removes the connection from my hand. Okay, we'll look at what to do in that case. My connection can also collapse. So I can be here, maybe I make a mistake with my elbow, with my shoulder, and all of a sudden this thing collapses and here comes the bad guy, right? It may be on purpose, or he may stumble when my connection collapses because he may have been leaning a little too much on that connection as well. In any case, I need to have a plan for when my connection collapses. And finally, as I've already mentioned, my connection could stay stable. Now, let's talk about stability first. If my connection stays stable and I'm in this position, I can throw a split punch, I can throw a curved punch, I can throw any of my techniques as I release the connection. I don't really need to move out of my structure to strike in that situation. I can strike and reconnect, strike and reconnect. And there's a huge number of drills and applications we could use with this concept. So even though this is technically the interface between striking and grappling, I'm not committed to continuing to go into grappling after I make the connection. I can stop at the connection and fight from this little interface. But I could also use this connection to manipulate my opponent and try to close in, try to maybe move him towards some place where it'd be easier to take down. A lot of different possibilities. If my connection begins to dissolve, and that means the bad guy's coming towards me, so I'm here and he begins to dissolve, well, I'm probably, from this position, going to want to be able to strike him as he comes towards me. But I do not want to stay in this structure. So from the structure that I'm in good situation here as it dissolves to step that foot forward. My connection dissolves. That means I instantly start to fall that way. If I've sagged my hips correctly, I have one hip forward. That's the foot that steps. One of your best basic drills from this concept is to get a good connection and practice taking this step. Once you've got that, you can fire a punch at the same time you take the step. Boom, you come right back as a repeating drill. You can do this with a heavy bag, you can do this with a pad holder, you can do it with a trapping dummy. So if my connection dissolves, I step into him. If my connection collapses and he comes towards me, then I'm going to step this back. I want to create distance. So he's coming towards me and I punch. Look at the difference in distance between this straight punch and like this one would go through the wall. Which is good because if the structure collapses or if the connection collapses, he's probably moving backwards. He's probably backing out into the sweet spot of my punch. Now let's talk about the catch connection. The same things still apply. If this connection suddenly dissolves and I've got my hips properly sagged, I need to have a foot ready. So whichever hip is sagging in the direction that I start to fall, that's my step. So if the connection dissolves because he moved away or because the grip broke, I'm not sure what's going on there, but I want my balance. It certainly doesn't hurt much to fire that punch. He may be there, he may not. If this collapses, it's actually difficult for a grip connection to collapse, but what it can do is your grip can come loose. So if you want to use the word collapse to define that, that's fine. You're still going to want to be able to take your step backwards. It is possible that the opponent drags you that way. So if I'm here, I want to be ready to release my connection and repost my foot in case he tries to drag me that way. Then I can go into striking from there. Now, some other options from here. Let's say, for example, that I want to knee. Well, I can knee with either leg, depending on how things go. I can step in and knee, and from here, I can execute a switch. If I prefer kneeing with my right leg, I can execute a switch. Now, I should keep this hand up, but I want you to see the action. So from here, switch, fire the knee. I can throw either elbow. This is really good if I get him to push hard on my connection and I suddenly release it and let him walk right into a right elbow. If he makes it a little further in, the left elbow can hit him. And as I've already mentioned, either of my knees could strike. So from here, I could step back for the left knee, or step in with the left knee, or I could switch for the right knee. So I hope this gives you some ideas about some of the possibilities about this interface between connecting to the opponent, potentially for grappling, and not connecting with the opponent, staying out here where you're just relaying kinetic energy to them. This has always been a fascinating part of the martial arts to me. Some systems really pay attention to this, like Silat. Silat is brilliant at this. There are a lot of Kung Fu styles that are really good, like Bagua is really good at this interface. You could even say it's their specialty. I really find it interesting to see what one art gets good at and what another art doesn't pay any attention to. Because specialization brings a lot of data. They learn a lot of things, and I like to steal what I can from wherever I can in the martial arts. Anyway, I'll drop it there and leave it for you. You guys stay safe, wash your hands, and I'll see you next time.